They called it Andrew's grave, a ridiculous, dirt-covered mound dug directly into the side of a frozen Colorado mountain. When the deadliest blizzard of the decade severed the county from the world, the mocking stopped, because while the town burned their furniture to survive, Andrew was sweating in a t-shirt. The town of Bitter Creek, Colorado, sits in a jagged valley where the wind doesn't just blow, it hunts. The locals are hardened, pragmatic people. They measure a man's worth by the thickness of his cabin walls and the size of his woodpile. So, when Andrew Pendleton arrived in the spring of 2014, a retired structural engineer from Seattle with soft hands and a blueprint that looked like a badger's den, the town had a collective field day. Andrew had purchased a 4-acre plot on Ridge Road, a notorious stretch of land exposed to the brutal northern winds. The previous owner had abandoned it because the bedrock was too shallow and the winter drifts were lethal. But Andrew didn't want to build up. He wanted to build in. Instead of ordering the standard massive Douglas fir logs for a traditional A-frame or a stout rectangular cabin, Andrew rented a heavy-duty Komatsu excavator. For 3 weeks, the mechanical beast roared on the hillside, gouging a massive, semicircular crater into the south-facing slope. Down at Hank's Hardware, the center of Bitter Creek's gossip mill, the ridicule flowed as freely as the burnt coffee. "I drove past the ridge yesterday," Kevin Miller, a towering local logger with a voice like grinding stones, announced to the regulars. "City boy is digging himself a tomb, says he's building an earth-sheltered home, a damn hobbit hole." Laughter erupted around the wood stove. Hank Davies, the store owner, shook his head, wiping down the counter. "I sold him 100 yards of EPDM rubber liner yesterday. He's waterproofing the dirt. I told him, 'Artie, when January hits, that ground freezes solid 3 feet down. You're going to be living inside a human-sized ice cube.'" But Andrew ignored the stares and the unsolicited advice. He had a secret, forged in the agonizing memory of a grid failure in upstate New York 6 years prior, where he had nearly lost his toes to frostbite in a sprawling, poorly insulated colonial home. He had learned the hard way that when the world turns to ice, traditional homes are just wooden tents leaking heat into the void. Andrew's design relied on the ancient science of thermal mass. Once the crater was dug, he built reinforced retaining walls using rammed earth tiles, hundreds of discarded steel-belted radials packed tight with sledgehammers and dirt. Inside this indestructible shell, he framed the house with reclaimed timber. The entire southern face was a wall of double-paned, argon-filled glass, angled at exactly 32 degrees to catch the low winter sun. Then came the part that solidified his reputation as the town lunatic. He buried it. Using the excavator, Andrew dragged the excavated mountain dirt back over the roof, piling it 3 feet thick. He planted wild fescue and clover over the top. By late September, if you approached from the north, you wouldn't even know a house was there. It just looked like a gentle swell in the hillside with a thick stone chimney protruding from the grass. The true test of Bitter Creek's hierarchy, however, was the woodpile. By October, every respectable property in the valley was flanked by a towering fortress of split oak, pine, and birch. Kevin Miller had stacked an impressive 14 cords of wood, a monumental wall of fuel ready to be fed into his roaring cast-iron stove. Andrew, meanwhile, spent exactly 3 days splitting wood. He stacked a meager 2.5 cords under a small lean-to by his reinforced oak door. When Kevin saw it, he couldn't resist pulling his pickup truck over. "Hey, Artie," Kevin hollered, leaning out the window. "You expecting a short winter? That pile won't last you past Thanksgiving. You're gonna freeze in that mole hole. I got $10, says the county sheriff is thawing you out by New Year's." Andrew wiped the sweat from his brow, leaning on his splitting maul. He looked at Kevin, then down at his small, neatly stacked pile. "I appreciate the concern, Kevin, but the earth is a heavy blanket. I think I'll be all right." Kevin spat out the window, muttered, "Dead man walking," and drove off. The town had made its verdict. Andrew Pendleton was a fool, and the mountain was going to teach him a fatal lesson. The winter of 2014 did not arrive. It invaded. Meteorologists called it a stationary polar vortex, but the old-timers in Bitter Creek just called it the White Death. It began in the second week of December with a deceptively quiet, powdery snowfall that didn't stop for 4 days. Then the wind shifted, screaming down from the Canadian Arctic. By December 18th, the temperature plummeted to 22 degrees below zero. The main highway was buried under 6-foot drifts. The snowplows stopped running because their diesel lines were gelling in the cold. Then, the inevitable happened. A massive pine snapped under the weight of ice on the county line, taking the main transmission lines with it. Bitter Creek went dark. At first, there was no panic. This was what the town prepared for. Generators coughed to life, and chimneys plumed with thick grey smoke. In Kevin Miller's sprawling log home, the great stone fireplace and the secondary wood stove were roaring, but Kevin quickly realized a grim physical reality. Log cabins, while sturdy, are notorious for thermal bridging. The freezing wind found every micro-fissure in the chinking. To keep the inside temperature at a barely tolerable 55 degrees, Kevin was feeding heavy logs into the fire every 90 minutes, day and night. Up on Ridge Road, the world was a howling white void. The wind ripped across the mountain at 60 miles per hour, scouring the landscape. But 3 feet below the frozen crust, Andrew Pendleton was experiencing a different reality. Andrew's hobbit hole was an absolute masterclass in passive survival. The earth surrounding his home, thousands of tons of dirt and rock, acted as an immense thermal battery. The ground beneath the frost line maintains a constant temperature of about 52 degrees Fahrenheit year-round, while the air outside was a lethal minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. The walls of Andrew's home were naturally radiating a baseline warmth. When the sun broke through the clouds for just 3 hours on a Tuesday afternoon, the low-angled rays flooded through the southern glass wall, striking the dark slate tiles Andrew had laid on the floor. The tiles absorbed the solar radiation, trapping the heat. That night, as the temperature outside dropped to minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit, Andrew sat in a thin, long-sleeved t-shirt, reading a novel by the light of an LED lantern. The ambient temperature inside his buried cabin was a comfortable 66 degrees. He walked over to his small, high-efficiency masonry heater. He didn't load it with heavy logs. He didn't need to. He placed 3 small, split pieces of dry pine inside and lit them. The fire burned fast and hot for an hour, heating the dense brick of the stove, which would slowly radiate warmth into the room until morning. He had used roughly 1/10 of the wood Kevin Miller burned in a single evening. By the second week of January, the grid was still down. The roads were utterly impassable, a chaotic graveyard of abandoned vehicles, and Bitter Creek was running out of fuel. The sheer volume of wood required to fight off negative 30-degree weather in above-ground houses was staggering. Kevin Miller, the man who had bragged about his 14 cords, stared in horror at his diminishing pile. It was more than halfway gone, and winter was far from over. Exhaustion was setting in across the valley. Men were waking up at 2 a.m., shivering, the fires having died down, the cold creeping in like an assassin. Desperation began to erode the town's pride. Generators had long since run out of gasoline. Pipes were bursting in the walls of expensive homes. Hank Davies, the hardware store owner, was forced to move his wife and 2 kids into their basement, hanging heavy blankets over the stairs to trap what little heat their struggling wood stove could produce. On the night of January 14th, the storm intensified into a blinding whiteout. Kevin Miller had spent the last 3 hours trying to drag a dead, frozen windfall tree out of the nearby woods using a manual winch, tearing his gloves and practically freezing his fingers. He had miscalculated. His house was bleeding heat faster than he could chop wood. He needed more, and he knew a man who supposedly wasn't using his. Kevin wrapped himself in 3 layers of wool, grabbed his heavy flashlight, and strapped on his snowshoes. He was going to hike up Ridge Road. In his mind, Andrew was probably dead, frozen solid in his tomb. If that was the case, his 2 cords of perfectly split wood were just sitting there, waiting to be claimed. It was a dark, opportunistic thought, but survival was making a monster out of him. The trek up the ridge was agonizing. The wind felt like broken glass against Kevin's exposed skin. His eyelashes froze together. By the time he crested the hill, his lungs were burning, and hypothermia was beginning to cloud his judgment. He expected to find a dark, snow-buried mound. Instead, he stopped dead in his tracks. A faint, golden glow emanated from the snowbank ahead. Through the howling blizzard, Kevin could see the recessed, sheltered alcove of Andrew's southern wall. The snow had completely blown over the curved roof, creating an aerodynamic dome that the wind simply slipped right over. There was no whistling, no creaking timber. Just a solid, immovable bunker. Kevin stumbled toward the glass, his legs giving out. He fell onto the sheltered patio, shielded from the wind by the earthen berms. He pressed his frozen, gloved hand against the thick, double-pane glass. Inside, illuminated by the soft glow of a battery-powered lamp, he saw Andrew Pendleton. Andrew was sitting in a plush armchair, holding a steaming mug of tea. He was wearing a short-sleeved cotton shirt. Kevin banged his heavy fist against the glass, the sound dull and desperate. Andrew turned, his eyes widening as he saw the frost-bitten, snow-caked giant collapsing against his window. Andrew didn't freeze or panic. When you have spent a lifetime engineering structures to withstand catastrophic loads, you learn to process crises with mechanical precision. He slammed his book down onto the slate table, unlatched the heavy, steel-reinforced oak door, and threw his shoulder against the wood to break the seal of frost. The wind shrieked like a wounded animal, instantly blasting a blinding spray of powder into the cabin. Andrew reached into the maelstrom, grabbed Kevin Miller by the heavy collar of his frozen wool coat, and hauled the massive snow-caked logger inside. He didn't pull Kevin directly into the warm living room. That was a rookie mistake. Instead, Andrew dragged the heavy man into the mudroom, a small, enclosed 6x6 vestibule designed specifically as an airlock. Its sole architectural purpose was to prevent the cabin's precious, stored thermal energy from being sucked out into the sub-zero void. Only after sealing and latching the thick outer door, cutting off the deafening roar of the blizzard, did Andrew open the insulated inner door and pull Kevin onto the warm slate floor of the main living area. Kevin collapsed onto his back like a felled redwood. His breath came in ragged, shallow, wet gasps. His beard was a solid, jagged block of ice, adhering his chin to the collar of his coat, and his skin carried the terrifying, waxy pallor of advanced hypothermia. Andrew immediately went to work. He didn't drag Kevin right next to a roaring fire. In fact, there wasn't a visible fire to drag him to. Furthermore, Andrew knew from his wilderness survival training that applying intense, direct heat to severely frostbitten tissue causes cells to rupture, leading to excruciating tissue death and gangrene. The thawing process had to be ambient and internal. Fetching a pair of heavy medical shears from his emergency kit, Andrew began methodically cutting away Kevin's frozen outer layers. The fabric was stiff as sheet metal. Don't have to do this," Kevin stammered, his jaw trembling so violently his teeth clicked like castanets. His eyes, rimmed with frozen lashes, darted wildly around the room. I came to steal your wood, Artie. I thought you were dead. I brought an axe." Andrew paused, the shears biting through the thick canvas of Kevin's overalls. He locked eyes with the shivering giant. His expression was entirely devoid of judgment or malice. It reflected only the harsh, unforgiving reality of the situation. When the temperature drops below -30, civilization is just a suggestion, Kevin, Andrew said, his voice low and steady. The cold makes desperate animals of us all. Morality requires a core body temperature of 98 degrees. Save your breath. Drink this. Andrew pressed a thermos of lukewarm, heavily sugared black tea to Kevin's cracked lips, tilting it slowly to prevent the man from choking. As the simple carbohydrates and hydration hit his shocked system, Kevin's vision began to clear. The violent shivering subsided into a dull, agonizing ache as blood painstakingly returned to his extremities. For the first time since falling against the glass, Kevin actually processed his surroundings. The interior of the dirt tomb was nothing short of a revelation. The walls weren't muddy, dark, or claustrophobic. They were finished in smooth, white earthen plaster that caught and amplified the soft, warm light of a few strategically placed LED lanterns. Thick, exposed Douglas fir timber beams spanned the ceiling, radiating a sense of absolute, crushing strength against the thousands of pounds of earth resting above them. But what stunned Kevin completely, what broke his understanding of how winter survival worked, was the air itself. In his own massive log cabin, the air near his cast-iron fireplace was scalding hot, while the air near the exterior walls was bitterly cold. This extreme temperature differential created constant, freezing convection drafts that swept across the floor, chilling his feet even when his face was sweating. Here, the air was entirely still. The warmth was omnipresent, heavy, and wrapping around him like a thick down comforter. It didn't feel like it was coming from a singular, desperate source. It felt like the room itself was alive and breathing heat. "Where's the stove?" Kevin managed to croak, sitting up slowly, his joints popping. He realized he was sweating under his thermal shirt. "It's a damn oven in here." Andrew pointed to a massive, beautifully tiled structure standing in the center of the open floor plan. It looked more like an oversized European baker's oven than a traditional wood stove, stretching nearly to the ceiling. "It's a Russian masonry heater," Andrew explained, checking the room's digital thermostat, which read a steady 68 degrees Fahrenheit. A traditional cast-iron stove sends roughly 80% of its thermal energy straight up the chimney. You are heater of the Colorado sky, Kevin. This heater, however, channels the exhaust smoke through a massive labyrinth of internal, zigzagging fire brick baffles before it ever reaches the flue. Kevin stared at the small, tempered glass door of the firebox. There were no logs burning inside, only a small pile of soft grey ash and a few dimly glowing embers remained. "I haven't put a single piece of wood in there since 8 o'clock last night," Andrew stated, anticipating the logger's profound disbelief. "I burn one small, intensely hot fire for exactly 1 hour. The dense fire bricks absorb all that kinetic thermal energy. Then, for the next 24 hours, the stone slowly radiates that trapped heat into the room. Combined with the thousands of tons of earth surrounding our walls, which acts as a gigantic insulating blanket that never drops below 50 degrees, The heat simply has nowhere to go. It stays with us." Kevin rubbed his thawing hands over his face. The physical pain of his warming fingers was sharp and biting, but it was eclipsed by the sheer gravity of his own ignorance. The town had mocked Andrew. They had called him a fool, a city boy playing in the dirt. But Andrew hadn't built a house. He had engineered an impenetrable survival pod. He had used thermodynamics and physics to defeat the mountain, while the rest of them were trying to fight a losing, exhausting battle with brute force and cords of burning timber. Suddenly, a horrifying realization struck Kevin, cutting straight through the comfortable, enveloping warmth of the cabin. His eyes widened in terror. "Artie," Kevin said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, panic-stricken whisper. "If I was freezing to death in my place with 3 cords of wood left. Hank Davies. Oh God, Hank!" Andrew turned from the kitchen counter, his brow furrowing instantly. "Hank, the hardware owner. What about him?" He moved Sarah and their 2 kids down into their unfinished concrete basement 3 days ago, Kevin said, his chest heaving as the adrenaline returned. Their main stove upstairs cracked right down the middle when the freeze hit. It drafts poorly. Hank was literally burning his kitchen cabinets yesterday morning just to keep the basement pipes from bursting. His youngest girl, Lily, she had a terrible, rattling chest cough before the storm even hit. "If I was freezing out there, Artie. They are dying. Right now, they are dying in the dark." Andrew looked at the digital readout of his internal temperature. It had risen to 69 degrees Fahrenheit, just from the addition of Kevin's body heat and his own movement. He looked around the vast, open floor plan of his living area. It was 1,200 square feet of perfectly insulated, secure thermal mass. Andrew walked purposefully over to his heavy gear closet. He didn't say a word. He pulled out 2 heavy, expedition-grade, down-filled parkas, insulated waterproof bibs, and thick neoprene face masks. He threw 1 set at Kevin's feet. "Put this on," Andrew commanded. His tone had shifted entirely. He was no longer a gracious host. He was an engineer presented with a critical, catastrophic system failure that required immediate intervention. "We aren't going to let them freeze. Artie, we can't drag a sled of wood down into the valley in this storm," Kevin argued, struggling to stand on his unsteady legs. "It's a death sentence. The drifts are 6 feet high. The wind chill is -40. "We aren't bringing them wood, Kevin," Andrew replied, securing a high lumen headlamp tightly over a thick wool beanie and checking the battery pack. He grabbed a heavy coil of static climbing rope from the wall. "Wood isn't going to save them now. We're bringing them here. We're putting them in the earth." The descent into Bitter Creek was a journey through a frozen hellscape. The wind chill had plummeted to an incomprehensible -45 degrees Fahrenheit. Andrew and Kevin moved like astronauts on a hostile planet, tethered together by a heavy nylon climbing rope, dragging a heavy-duty fiberglass rescue toboggan behind them. The town below was entirely dark, save for the faint, desperate orange flickers of dying fires in frosted windows. When they finally breached the back door of Hank Davies's home, the scene inside was devastating. The house was a walk-in freezer. The breath of the family plumed in thick, white clouds in the dim light of a single candle. Hank was on his knees in the living room, swinging a dull hatchet at a mahogany dining room chair, his face streaked with soot and frozen tears. Sarah was huddled under a pile of sleeping bags in the corner, clutching their 2 children. The youngest, Lily, was lethargic, her lips a terrifying shade of pale blue. "Hank!" Kevin roared over the wind howling outside. Hank spun around, raising the hatchet defensively before realizing who it was. "Kevin!" "What?" "How are you out in this? We're out of wood. We're burning the heirlooms. It's not enough. "We're leaving," Andrew interrupted, stepping past Kevin and kneeling beside the children. He checked Lily's pulse. It was thready, and her skin was dangerously cold. "Wrap them in every blanket you have. We are putting them on the sled." "Where?" Sarah cried out, her voice hoarse. "There's nowhere to go. The high school shelter lost power 3 days ago." "Up Ridge Road," Kevin said, placing a heavy hand on Hank's shoulder. "To Andrew's place." Hank stared at Kevin like he had lost his mind. "The dirt hole? Kevin, he's exposed on the ridge. It's a tomb." "Hank, listen to me." Kevin grabbed the smaller man by the collar, his voice leaving absolutely no room for debate. "I was dead an hour ago. I walked into Andrew's house, and he was sitting in a t-shirt. Do not argue. Pack the kids." The extraction was grueling. They placed Sarah and the 2 children in the toboggan, burying them under a mountain of down comforters and an insulated tarp. Hank, Kevin, and Andrew took the tow ropes. The climb back up Ridge Road tested the absolute limits of human endurance. For 2 hours, the 3 men battled thigh-deep snow, fighting a headwind that threatened to push them back down into the valley with every step. Andrew, despite being older and smaller than the other 2, set a relentless, metronomic pace. He knew the math. He knew exactly how many calories they were burning and how much time they had before hypothermia would stop their hearts. When they finally dragged the sled onto Andrew's sheltered patio, Hank collapsed, weeping openly into the snow. Andrew initiated the airlock protocol, ushering everyone inside. As the inner door sealed shut, locking the roaring tempest outside, the silence of the earth-sheltered home washed over the exhausted survivors. Hank and Sarah frantically unwrapped the children. As the heavy comforters were pulled back, the ambient 68-degree air of the cabin hit them. Lily gasped, her eyes fluttering open, coughing weakly but breathing in the still, warm air. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, pulling off her frozen mittens and pressing her hands against the smooth plaster wall. It's radiating. The walls are warm." Hank just stood in the center of the room, staring at the masonry heater, then at the massive windows overlooking the apocalyptic storm outside. He looked at Andrew, the man he had ruthlessly mocked over his hardware counter for months. "Andrew, Hank stammered, shame coloring his frost-bitten cheeks. "Don't," Andrew said gently, walking into his small kitchen and striking a match to light a portable alcohol stove. "I've got beef stew in jars from last summer's garden. Let's get some calories in you all." Over the next 48 hours, the true genius of Andrew's design revealed itself. As the storm raged on, completely isolating Bitter Creek from the state, Andrew's home didn't just maintain its temperature, it began to heat up. Every human body radiates approximately 100 watts of thermal energy at rest. By bringing 5 people into the highly insulated, airtight environment of the earth-sheltered cabin, they had introduced 500 watts of continuous biological heating. Combined with the thermal mass of the earth and the sporadic bursts of sunlight piercing the clouds to hit the slate floors, the internal temperature of the cabin climbed to an astonishing 74 degrees Fahrenheit. On the 3rd afternoon, Andrew actually had to walk over to the northern wall and crack open an overhead ventilation draft to let some of the heat out. Kevin watched him do it, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. "You're venting heat in a -30-degree blizzard. You are venting heat." "Airflow is important," Andrew smiled, adjusting the vent. "Can't have it getting stuffy." Hank sat near the glass, watching the snow swirl outside. "Andrew, when we get out of here..." "If we get out of here, I brought whatever scrap wood I had left in my pack. You need it. You must be running low." Andrew walked over to the reinforced door, opened it slightly, and pointed to his lean-to outside. Through the blowing snow, Hank and Kevin could clearly see Andrew's woodpile. It was barely touched. He had used perhaps a quarter of a single cord since October. "Keep your scraps, Hank," Andrew said softly, closing the door. "The earth provides, as long as you know how to ask it." The White Death finally broke on January 19th. The winds died down, and the sun rose over a valley buried under an ocean of white. When the National Guard finally pushed through the highway with heavy rotary plows 3 days later, they expected a mass casualty event in Bitter Creek. Instead, they found a battered but surviving town. They found burst pipes, ruined homes, and a traumatized populace. But the death toll was miraculously low. Word quickly spread about what had happened on Ridge Road. The story of Kevin Miller's desperate hike and the subsequent rescue of the Davies family became the defining legend of the winter. Andrew Pendleton never gloated. He never visited Hank's hardware to demand an apology. He simply went back to his quiet life, reading books by the southern windows and tending to his indoor greenhouse. But the town of Bitter Creek was forever changed. By the time spring thawed the frozen earth, the mocking had been entirely replaced by a quiet, profound reverence. In May, a heavy flatbed truck drove up Ridge Road, carrying a load of massive, reclaimed steel beams. Kevin Miller was behind the wheel. He parked at the bottom of Andrew's driveway, stepped out, and looked up at the green, grass-covered roof of the survival pod. Andrew stepped out onto his patio, holding a cup of coffee. "What's this, Kevin?" Kevin took off his cap, scratching his head. He looked at the steel beams, then back at Andrew. "My log cabin is structurally ruined, Artie. The ice heaved the foundation, and the pipes destroyed the framing." He paused, swallowing his pride. "I was wondering, if you weren't too busy, if you might have time to help me design a dirt hole of my own." Andrew took a sip of his coffee, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I've got my drafting table set up inside. Come on in. It's perfectly cool in here." The story of Ridge Road is a stark reminder that we cannot conquer nature through sheer force or ego. True resilience comes from working with our environment. Andrew's buried home triumphed because he prioritized physics, thermal mass, and passive efficiency over traditional aesthetics and town gossip. In the end, the smartest engineering doesn't fight the mountain, it becomes part of it.